seismic day in Washington. The National Security Advisor out. Now the White House doing major damage control about one Michael Flynn. Political reporter joins us to give us the very latest on the ground. Then we look at the fallout from the Flynn affair, the investigations, the administration's credibility, the legal issues. We'll dig deeply into it all. Also, the White House and the media. How the administration is able to dodge a whole lot of tough questions, even though it's answering questions every day. Evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. We have a packed show for you tonight. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, he is out. And now the White House trying to explain what happened. President Trump's National Security Advisor Michael Flynn out. This morning at the White House, the president ignored shouted questions about Flynn. Press Secretary Sean Spicer could not.
The evolving and eroding level of trust as a result of this situation and a series of other questionable instances is what led the president to ask for General Flynn's resignation.
Late last night, this resignation letter. Flynn made it clear he was leaving because he misled Vice President Pence and other senior officials about his conversations last December with the Russian ambassador. The phone calls happened right as President Obama hit Russia with sanctions over meddling in our elections. Vice President Pence repeated the false information on national TV. It turns out the Justice Department knew about Flynn's lie through surveillance of the Russian ambassador and alerted the White House 3 weeks ago. But the question is, did the president know?
I can't reveal what the White House knew or didn't know and who in the White House knew or didn't know.
The president's response, a tweet. The real story here is why there's so many illegal leaks coming out of Washington. Congressional Democrats demanding answers and investigations. And for more on the Flynn scandal, political White House reporter Matthew Nussbaum joins us now. A lot to unpack here, but let's first start with what we heard from Sean Spicer today. To me, two notable things. One, that this wasn't a voluntary resignation. It was asked for by the president. And secondly, that the president reportedly knew for weeks that Flynn wasn't being truthful. I'm trying to match that up to what the president said this past Friday, where he said he was learning about this for the first time. Help me out here with the timeline and why those two things aren't contradictory.
That's right. So Sean Spicer attempted to explain that away by saying the president was specifically asked about the Washington Post report, which was obviously on this topic of Spicer discussing the sanctions with the Russian ambassador, and that's why Trump said he hadn't heard of it. It wasn't that he was referring to having not heard of the situation in general. So that's how Spicer explained it. And he also said that the problem here was not so much that this had occurred, but rather that he misled Vice President Mike Pence. And he said that's really where the situation came in.
Well, I want to get to that and where the folks in the Hill, if they're aligned with that or not. But obviously the two huge questions, I know we don't know the answers, but where it goes from here, and that is, we do know that Department of Justice warned the White House last month that Flynn was not being truthful, and they warned about the potential for blackmail. Now, my question to you is, from what we heard today, did that not go up the food chain immediately? I mean, you hear the word blackmail, you would think that would raise alarms. Do we have any clarity yet who was told what and when?
We don't have a lot of clarity, but Spicer seemed to make it clear that as soon as the Justice Department alerted the White House counsel briefed President Trump and some of President Trump's top advisors that these conversations between Flynn and the ambassador had taken place and that sanctions were discussed. So then that brings up the question you ask, which is why for the past few weeks was Flynn continued to allow to sit in on these briefings? Why was he why was Mike Pence not made aware of the contradictory statements that now have led to his ouster? So it raises a lot of questions about, if Trump knew this weeks ago, why are we only finding out about it now?
And Matthew, the next question, obviously I'm not the first to ask it, is if in fact Flynn, and we all believe he did have these conversations with his Russian counterparts regarding the sanctions for an administration that hadn't even been sworn in, do people really believe, especially the guy with an intelligence background, would go rogue without any blessing or knowledge, tacit or otherwise, from his superiors? Give me an idea about that and where the inquiry could go in that I got to think because they weren't sworn in, subpoenas could get to the bottom of that, right?
Yeah, so obviously to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador without direction from higher up would raise alarm bells, I think, and definitely has some people scratching their heads. Sean Spicer's claiming that Michael Flynn did this without direction, but that definitely strikes some as odd, and that's why Democrats are calling for a more robust investigation into connections between the Trump campaign and between Flynn and the Russians. But again, with the Republicans in control of Congress, it's an open question as to whether or not an investigation will actually proceed and how much power a committee investigating this would have to subpoena people and to look into these connections.
Well, that does bring the next question, which is, what are you hearing in terms of Republican appetite for this? You heard Democratic Congressman Schiff here hint more to come. Do Republicans really want to go shoulder to shoulder with the administration on this, given so much of the unknown? What's your sense here? Will they go for an independent prosecutor? Senator Schumer and others are calling for that. Where are Republicans' hearts and minds on this? Some talk about leaks as the big issue, which to me seems really tone deaf given the events of today.
Well, there's not a lot of unity. Like you mentioned, some are trying to point this in the direction of leaks and say, hey, we should be focusing more on that. Others, like Paul Ryan, are saying they wouldn't support an investigation, that the issue is settled now that Flynn has left. And then still others who are more hawkish on Russia, like Senator Lindsey Graham, even Senator John Cornyn of Texas, are calling for a more robust investigation into this. So it remains to be seen whether the Republicans will be able to coalesce around a stance and whether that stance will align with the White House stance, which is that there's nothing to see here, basically.
Well, Matthew, when they make that decision where they want to go politically, is it almost a secondary point in that, from what we understand, the FBI is still fully investigating this regarding the dossier story that seems to be gaining a little bit more credibility as the weeks have gone on here, and the belief that somehow, some way, with all the leaks, that this is going to get out there anyway? Is there a sense, might as well get out ahead of this so they don't own it too?
Well, I think congressional Republicans were caught off guard by a lot of this. We know that they haven't even been in the loop on some of these executive orders that have come out of the White House. So I think they, in a lot of ways, are scrambling to stay on the same page to try to get ahead of this story. But I think they're very much in the dark on all this, too. So they don't know when or whether the next shoe is going to drop.
Matthew, just a couple process questions internally. Exactly why would Kellyanne Conway come out yesterday and say that Flynn has the full support of the White House when we heard today even Sean Spicer saying for weeks that this was common knowledge internally? Pence reportedly been pushing for the ouster of Flynn. Does she speak for the White House? Does she know what's going on? It seems that the messengers and the messaging is so crossing right now, you don't know who to believe.
Well, that had a lot of people scratching their heads today, especially the timing of that. She said just about an hour before Spicer announced they were looking into it, and just a few hours before the actual resignation, that Flynn had the president's full confidence. And then she reiterated this morning that he still had the president's confidence, but it was a trust issue with the vice president and that sort of thing. She seemed to make it sound as though Flynn had offered to resign, whereas today Spicer was telling us that Trump asked for that resignation. So I think there's a lot of confusion about who speaks for this White House. And there's been a couple of occasions now where she's gotten out on a path that people aren't really sure what she's saying or at whose behest she is saying it.
And finally, Matthew, you know this better than anybody, the volume of leaks from so many different agencies going on right now in this administration, coupled with the fact that there's now a vacuum. By all accounts, whatever people thought of Flynn, he did have the ear of the president. It sounds like a Game of Thrones question, but who fills this vacuum right now with Flynn gone? And is the power struggles, as we've heard about them, as real, coming from you as a guy on the ground?
Well, so I think that's a real question of who gains from Flynn's departure. There's some who think that James Mattis, the defense secretary, and Rex Tillerson over at the State Department will be able to flex their muscles a little bit more now with him out of the way. But there's also a possibility that that power center will stay in the White House or will move to whoever replaces Flynn, which could be David Petraeus even making a return to the scene. So I think the question of who comes out on top in all this is very much on people's minds.
Matthew, I certainly appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we will get into the politics and the legal questions here. But first, to fully understand the Flynn story and how we got here and the way the White House dealt with him, we wanted to take you through the full timeline of what Flynn did and also what the White House knew and when. So we asked Andrew here to take us through the complete timeline of this. Andrew?
And Rich, as we heard from Sean Spicer earlier, the White House is saying today that the president's confidence in Michael Flynn simply eroded over the past few weeks. But the White House also says that the president knew 3 weeks ago, and until yesterday, the day Flynn resigned, there was little evidence that Flynn ever had anything but the full confidence of President Trump. In the summer of 2014, Michael Flynn was dismissed as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, working under President Obama. A year and a half later, Flynn is paid to attend a dinner in Moscow celebrating the Russia Today TV news channel. He sits next to Vladimir Putin. 2 months later, Flynn is advising the Trump campaign. A prominent Trump backer, Flynn is among the top foreign policy advisors and speaks at the Republican convention. Ironically, his speech includes this message.
We do not need a reckless president who believes she is above the law.
Before Election Day, Flynn contacts Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the U.S. We don't know what they spoke about, but the conversation takes on added weight after Trump wins the election November 8th. Within 2 weeks, Flynn is named as the nominee for National Security Advisor. On December 29th, Flynn calls Kislyak 5 times. The phone lines are not secured, and as a matter of protocol, the U.S. monitors the calls, as they do with any calls to or from the ambassador. The timing is critical because on that same day, President Obama announces new sanctions against Russia and the eviction of some Russian diplomats for hacking the election campaign. Trump's reaction, quote, "It's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things." The assumption is that Putin will respond to the American moves in kind by expelling some American diplomats from Russia. Surprisingly, Putin declines. Trump's reaction? He tweets, "Great move on delay by Vladimir Putin. I always knew he was very smart." January 12th, the Washington Post breaks the Flynn phone call story, citing senior government officials asking what did Flynn say and did it undercut the U.S. sanctions. The next day, after he says he spoke to Flynn, Sean Spicer tells reporters Flynn had one call with the Russian ambassador, but denies the sanctions were discussed. 2 days later, Vice President-elect Mike Pence, who also says he spoke to Flynn, is asked about the Flynn calls.
It was strictly coincidental that they had a conversation. They did not discuss anything having to do with the United States' decision to expel diplomats or impose a censure against Russia.
So did they ever have a conversation about sanctions ever on those days or any other day?
They did not have a discussion.
Late January, Acting Attorney General Sally Yates, the same woman Trump would later fire for refusing to defend the Trump refugee ban, sends a letter to the White House counsel that Flynn was lying about his conversations with the ambassador and that those lies made Flynn vulnerable to blackmail by Russia. The White House takes no action. By February 1st, the day Flynn jumped into the press room briefing to put Iran on notice, the White House and the president say they are aware of the Flynn calls and that Flynn apparently misled the vice president. But again, no action is taken. 1 week later, February 8th, Flynn tells reporters he did not discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador. The next day, his spokesman walks that back. Now Flynn can't be certain the topic never came up. By Friday, February 10th, the Washington Post is reporting Flynn did discuss the sanctions in that December call. President Trump is asked about it later in the day on Air Force One. And despite the White House now saying the president had already been informed of the Flynn questions, he feigns ignorance to reporters.
What do you think of reports that General Flynn had conversations with the Russians about sanctions before you were sworn in?
I don't know about it. I haven't seen it. What report is that?
There are a number of
Washington
Post is reporting that he talked to the ambassador to Russia before you were inaugurated about sanctions, maybe trying to...
I haven't seen that. I'll look at that.
Fast forward to yesterday. In the afternoon, Kellyanne Conway tells MSNBC Trump maintains full confidence in Flynn. Hours later, Sean Spicer says Trump is evaluating the Flynn situation. Not long later, Flynn resigns as National Security Advisor. The White House now says Trump asked Flynn to resign.
My gosh.
It's like the worst John le Carré novel you've ever read.
Andrew, 3.5 weeks.
Yeah.
3.5 weeks.
Although it's been going on since November, late December. I mean, November was the first contact between Flynn and the ambassador. December 29th, I believe, is the day when they finally discussed the sanctions.
Every day you and I hear it's like new land speed records about new records for scandal, new records for dismissals, new records for a resignation, new record. Okay. Wow. Great job. Okay. Too much information, though, right? Coming up next, where do we go from here? FBI already investigating, but a bipartisan group of senators say that that is not enough. Our panel joins us to discuss.